All right. Good afternoon and good morning to those of you who are on the West Coast. My name is Catherine Osborne, and I am the project coordinator for Fordham University's initiative Taking Responsibility. Jesuit educational institutions confront the causes and legacy of clerical sexual abuse, which is a joint project of the Theology Department and the Curran Center for the Study of American Catholicism at Fordham. So on behalf of our director, Brad Hinsey, a professor of theology, and the rest of our leadership team, I want to welcome you all and thank you so much for joining us for this really important conversation. I'm just going to give a couple of housekeeping notes and then turn things over to our distinguished panel. So first, just a quick note about logistics. The panel is going to converse amongst itself for about 35 minutes, and then we will open it up to audience questions. Please put these, you can put them in anytime, into the Q&A. You should see the button at the bottom of your screen. Chat is disabled for the audience. If you have any trouble sending a question that way, you can also email it to takingresponsibility@fordham.edu, which an address I will put in the chat in a moment. And I will keep an eye on that box and make sure that the question gets to the moderator. So try the Q&A first, and if it doesn't work, then go ahead and email. And we will end promptly at 1 p.m. I know many of you have classes and other things to get to. Okay, second, on a less purely logistical note, to turn to the bigger topic. I also want to note that this webinar is the first, so thanks guys for going first, in a series that we are sponsoring this spring on historically marginalized communities and the abuse crisis in the United States. So please visit our website if you haven't already, and I'll put that link in the chat too, for more information on upcoming events that will be focused on Native American, Asian American, and Black Catholic communities and the abuse crisis. Our initiative at Fordham, the Taking Responsibility Initiative, is primarily focused on producing new research, but we wanted to take this semester, as our various grantees are getting underway, to highlight voices that are already engaged in shedding public light on these very under-discussed communities. So I really encourage you to join us for the other events, as well as to either join our low-volume mailing list or follow us on Twitter to hear about our other activities as they develop. And I'll put that link in the chat. All right, third, finally, last thing from me. I want to say on behalf of the panel as we get going that we're all aware, of course, that these are serious, upsetting topics for everyone, especially for any survivors that might be with us. Please take care of yourselves. Step away for a while if you need to. And we, of course, encourage you to reach out for support if anything that we discuss here today turns out to be especially difficult for you. So thank you very much for being engaged with us here again. And in lieu of formal introductions, so that we can get right into it, I'm just going to welcome you once more and turn things over to JD Long Garcia, Susan Reynolds, and Demelis Sacrist. Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you, Catherine. I'm JD Long Garcia. I am a senior editor at America Magazine, America Media. And one of my primary responsibilities there is to report on the Latin American church in the United States, or those of us that have Latin American roots. I'm joined by Dr. Susan Reynolds. If you could introduce yourself.
Sure, I'm Susan Reynolds. I'm Assistant Professor of Catholic Studies at Candler School of Theology at Emory University in Atlanta. I do research primarily on issues of race and culture in parish life, and have also done a bit of work on the abuse crisis as well, particularly in Latino communities.
And Demelis?
So I'm Demelis Sacrist, and I'm the Director of Formation at the Catholic Shrine of the Immaculate Conception in downtown Atlanta. And I've been in ministry in the Archdiocese of Atlanta for the last 15 years, especially with Hispanic communities. So I've had the privilege of working on both sides of ministry in our church.
Great, thank you, guys. I sometimes forget to mention, but I'm sort of a Latino incognito. You know, I was born in the Dominican Republic, and then my dad's from Chicago, so a hybrid. But before we get into it, I feel like it's important to say on that note that when we talk about Latinx or Latino, Hispanic communities, that we group a lot of people together under that umbrella, sometimes those pan-ethnic terms are convenient. At the same time, I think it's important to recognize the differences that exist within the different cultures. Sometimes I'll say, people ask about the Latinx vote, and I think, well, in Latin American countries, it isn't like we all vote the same. We vote very differently there. So, and we have different cultures even within our countries in Latin America. So, as we proceed through this conversation, I think it's important just to keep that in mind. So to start out with, I think in this conversation, again, as Catherine mentioned, we are welcoming questions. I'll be asking some questions, and we'll be asking questions of each other, but I'd like to invite those of you that are watching to participate too, because you'd have some questions for us. So please don't hesitate to do so. But to start things off, maybe Demelis, you can start us off with some of the particular issues that involve sexual abuse within the Latinx community.
I think, and I'll say, I grew up in Venezuela, so I was born in Venezuela. I grew up there, and then I moved to the States after I graduated from high school. So I'll say that in my generation, I think the hardest thing within our culture is to talk about sex, period. And I never had the talk in my house. That was never mentioned, talked about, or anything. So when you look at that pattern, it's inevitable that you'll have ill conversations or no conversations about how to be safe, how to protect yourself, what is inadequate, and what can be, how can you fall in a position of being abused by someone you trust.
That's great. I can also speak a little bit about that, just in terms of that uncomfortability and that lack of being able to talk about things, even within my own family circumstance as well, where there were certainly things that were more difficult to talk about. And certainly sexual abuse would be one of those. Dr. Reynolds, what differences have you noticed in your work in terms of the particularities of the Latinx community?
Sure, thank you. And by way of situating myself, sort of my own positionality, I'm not Latina. I am Euro-American. I grew up in Denver, Colorado, and lived for a time after college in Brownsville, Texas, and then subsequently moved to Boston, where I lived actually in the parish house of a highly racially and culturally diverse Catholic parish in Roxbury in Boston, where there was a large Dominican and Puerto Rican community, a large African-American community, and then a smaller Euro-American community, and ended up doing a great deal of both pastoral work and research with that particular community. And the work I've done since has centered primarily on parishes in which there are Latino communities in some capacity, and other communities as well. So that's really been the locus of my research. And I want to say I'm so grateful for this conversation as well. Culture and immigration status and race and ethnicity and class, I think, have all been really largely neglected dimensions of discourse and scholarly analysis surrounding the abuse crisis, both kind of in the academy and also just in our ecclesial conversations, our pastoral conversations. And this really shapes public perception of who survivors are and how justice occurs and what justice means and what reform might entail. I'm ignoring these dimensions, not only writes certain victims out of the sort of the narrative of the crisis, but it also really excludes them from potential solutions. And even, it causes us to propose solutions or reforms that may actually further marginalize certain communities, particularly some of the communities that we're talking about today. So I want to say to those folks at Fordham too, that I'm so grateful for this series of conversations that's being convened. A couple of the things that I have noticed are around dimensions of family, both the effect of what's often called familism or familialism, this cultural orientation that really prioritizes the good of the family and the community over that of the individual sometimes, which can lead victims of sexual violence and violent crimes to underreport or to not report when the perpetrator is somebody within the family's immediate network. They want to often avoid causing their family distress or shame, and therefore that abuse goes unreported or underreported. There's also a really interesting dynamic that I've observed in conversations in Latino parishes, broadly speaking, around the abuse crisis in general. Often the question that I hear in conversation groups among Latino families, and particularly women, is the question of where were the parents? Where was the mother of these victims? Instead of, I guess, placing the onus on the church structures or policies or priests themselves to protect minors, there's a sense that doing so is first and foremost the job of parents, of families. So that's an interesting dissonance, right? On the one hand, I think there's sort of this broad acknowledgement that in various Latino cultures, clergy sort of command respect, both as males and as representatives of the church. And then on the other, there's almost this kind of admission of the likelihood for clerical corruption, and that laity themselves and parents and guardians need to be like smart in guarding against it. So in both cases, we see this highly familial orientation to the conversation, whereas I feel in Euro-American spaces, the conversation tends to center very quickly on what are the structures, what are the policies, who's getting put in jail. It's sort of a much more policy-oriented conversation. Whereas, again, painting with very broad strokes in Latino communities, often the conversation begins at the level of the family.
Yeah, I think that is quite a contrast culturally. I wasn't there, but I've read reports about how the reaction in Boston and the Boston Archdiocese after abuse came out, and then you'd go to Latino parishes and you'd find people having prayer vigils, and you'd have there's this idea of reconciliation, forgiveness, even maybe to a fault. I don't know, but there was definitely kind of a different cultural reaction to what was going on. Demelis, would you care to speak to that?
Yes, yeah, and I'd like to add that I think within the Latino community, within the church, there's a sense that, well, it's happening to them over there, but not us, because of that underreporting, because of that culture of silence that we have around, machismo and even domestic violence and all of that, that to a certain point, as a community, we accept that this takes place. It's not good, but there's really not much we can do about it. And I've found in working in the Latino community that people have that kind of, oh yeah, well, that's not happening here. It's not happening to us, and sometimes during those trainings, we use Virtus as well in Atlanta now for a few years. And I made it a point to just have it, not just for the kids, but for the parents, in this realization that, wait, you mean like I can trust the church? And to them, or to us, challenging the authority or the trusting the church is, or a priest or a leader in the church, it's kind of synonymous with distrusting God. It kind of goes together. If this is God's house, how am I supposed to be weary of everyone around? What do you mean I can't send my 4-year-old and my 2-year-old to go to the bathroom while we're in church? And those kind of things that it almost kind of breaks my heart to kind of break that bubble for them and say, yeah, no, you can't. You have to, have that vigilance and over vigilance, and it's kind of saddened for us to realize that even in God's house, you don't feel safe, or you can't trust that you will be safe.
Yeah, if I can follow up on that, thank you very much. I think that's a huge reality to deal with. But I think that you're also speaking to generational differences within the community, and how perhaps depending on the age of individuals and what they've grown up with, and then you have, we were talking about the children and maybe what their expectations are. Have you seen that? Have you seen the generations react differently to the sexual abuse crisis and those protections and protective measures?
Well, it'd be good to clarify, even when we talk about generational differences, it also kind of in the newcomers, because also even
Mm,
if it's a younger generation, if they've just arrived from a rural part of their countries where, all of these things are not talked about, we're almost kind of back to square one. What I've seen, to your question, with second or third generation is that not just the cultural differences, but then we have the language difference and the perception of um, teens or kids that have grown up here kind of biculturally, but that they know that doesn't reconcile with what their parents values or point of views are. And it just kind of even creates this larger gap in communicating because yeah, I know what your church says about sex and contraception and all of these topics, and either I don't agree with them or I don't practice them. So what happens? I can talk to you about it. So that's that, like Susan was mentioning before, there's all these other elements that kind of become object barriers to really having that open conversations. It's when you have the immigration status, the how long you've been here, the resources. What do you know about what are the resources available to even protect or combat when something happens? And the sad part is, and I've had personal dealt with several families that have made the reporting right to the police and gone through all that trauma of dealing with it, and at the end nothing happens. It's a he said she said type thing, and in our culture, well, we may as well not said anything because now we have exposed ourselves, we have exposed our child, we have and so there's big misunderstandings from the cultural point of view of how is this advancing or protecting my children when all is done is publicly show that we didn't do our job.
yeah, and I think that speaks to what relates, if I could pick up a couple of threads out of what you're saying in terms of the the good of the family that Dr. Reynolds you were talking about initially, and I mean I've heard that even in relation to people who are discerning religious life, that they won't go that way because they want to get a job in order to help support the family, and there's lots of choices that are made on behalf of the family. But maybe picking up something else of what you were saying, Demelis, and can I ask you, Dr. Reynolds, to comment about the differences in status, and especially in terms of our undocumented community and some of the complications that that presents within this realm of sexual abuse and reporting.
Yeah, it plays a tremendous role. And actually, JD, I think I actually remember an article that you published in America in which you sort of warned us that really we should be prepared for the next wave, essentially, of abuse revelations to be coming from undocumented communities. I think we should probably assume that these cases have been vastly underreported. A lot of the revelations are there in the massive kind of court disclosures, personnel files, and things like that. And even honestly, to go through some of those personnel files is just it's horrifying, because what you find is account after account of priests who are known to be abusers, who have long histories of abuse, who've had 8, 9, 10, 11 different parish assignments, being reassigned into undocumented communities. This is what Patrick Wall calls the geographic solution to priestly abuse, essentially being shuttled off into undocumented communities. Often these abusers are also Latino. And so they have the cultural credibility, they understand the cultural dynamics and essentially leverage these cultural dynamics of silencing and taboos around sex and sexuality and homosexual activity and reporting of abuse. They have a sort of presumed intimacy with some of these families and essentially use that kind of cultural knowledge and intimacy to essentially further their abuse, and to do it with relative impunity, because they know that most likely these cases are not going to be reported. And if they're going to be reported, it's going to turn into an issue of he said, she said, and they're most likely going to not be turned in, essentially. So citizenship status plays a really, really important role. It's hard too, because it not only influences who ends up being victimized, but just as Demella said, it also influences the possibility of justice, right? Who has access to the justice system? Who's believed? You see victims from working class families, from undocumented families, again, being threatened with deportation by their abusers if they were to say something. And in cases where abuse is eventually exposed, often that reporting is done by a mother or an aunt or a grandmother. And then, of course, it also becomes a gender issue, right? It's like her word against his word, and who's going to be believed. And very often, it's not the mom or the aunt who's reporting the abuse. It's important to keep this in mind too, the sort of barriers to reporting as we think about potential reforms. Obviously, the kinds of reforms that have been proposed and in some cases accomplished in the past 2 decades, very important, shoring up, loopholes in the reporting process, putting processes in place and policies in place. But it's important to remember that policies are only as just as the institutions and societies and individuals tasked with enforcing them. So if you have, if your entire solution to clerical abuse is to put a clearer reporting process in place, but that reporting process is enforced within a society, within a diocese, within a church, where not everybody is granted the same credibility level, where not every voice is heard and taken seriously in the same way, then you're going to keep seeing these same asymmetries in justice. Yeah, so I think it's something that we really need to be very, very aware of.
Yeah, I think that helps understand in many ways some of the anger that Catholics feel about the abuse crisis. There are people that we've trusted, that we maybe hold on to a higher standard, and then when we discover, for example, that a priest who's been abusing minors, or in other cases of even adult abuse, that they get transferred to a Latino parish because they aren't going to do any reporting. That kind of really illustrates how heinous the sexual abuse crisis within the church can be. I have to say that myself, as a parent, my son's 13, that we've been having these conversations, and largely because of the things that we've learned as a society, as a church, over the last almost 20 years now, if not more, that we've been talking about this. I wanted to ask also about the differences in how we might be reacting to this in terms of our social status within the Latino community, or even that could relate to how educated individuals are, depending on what level of education we achieve. And I mean, in college, you have to take psychology 101, so you have to talk about things that you don't like, but if you're not at that level, you might not have had that exposure. But one of the questions, if I can take it early, actually, that we've gotten from our audience, and thank you very much for those of you who are already sending in questions. Please don't hesitate to do that. And maybe just a reminder for those of you who may have experienced abuse, or those of you who know someone who's experienced abuse, to please find someone who will provide resources for you to be able to talk about that, and to heal from that, but then also to hold people accountable for perpetrators. But anyway, sorry, the question that we had has to do with the differences within different communities. So we have within the United States. I'm not going to try to name everyone, but from South America, Central America, Mexico, the Caribbean, we have lots of different cultures there. Now, have you, Demelis, may I ask you, have you noticed differences within the cultures themselves when it comes to their association or their ability to deal and report abuse?
I think that more than a difference between, you know, the different countries or cultures, I think the big difference is it someone who is able to manage the language and it's able to really understand then what are the laws here, what are the differences. We had a big conversation at the Aquinas Center with one of the parishes around sexual abuse in a Hispanic community, and is our perception of, you know, a 15-year-old girl in rural parts of Latin America or South America, you know, is not seen as wrong to date an 18 or 19-year-old boy. And so when you have those parameters, or those are the customs or culturally accepted behaviors, and you come to the United States and you realize, when do you realize that that's different? How do you find out that there are actually laws that make that a crime? But that's how your grandmother and your aunts and your uncles and your parents, you know, ended up getting married. So how do you learn that there's a difference here? And I think first is not just education level, but probably that language proficiency, to be able to be exposed and aware, and maybe even, you know, guidance of relatives or friends who have been here longer, you know, that kind of can tell you, oh yeah, if you drive drunk, you know, if you have had a drink, don't drive because it costs $10,000 on average. You know, this kind of things that we just have a disconnect because we don't know exactly what the rules of the game are here. So I think that would make the biggest difference, rather than, you know, just from being Venezuelan or Puerto Rican or Mexican, you know, that would be a greater factor on silence, you know.
So if I can follow up on that, do you feel like that is it simply a matter of having things in the right language, or is it also the way that that information is communicated? I mean, my perception anyway is that for many people in the Latino community, they're not necessarily like print publication readers or something. They're not getting their diocesan publication necessarily as their source of information, but that they do consume a lot of other media, television and radio. Is it, how, I don't know if we can ask about that. Is it just a matter of having things in Spanish? Yeah.
I think it's a combination of things, because as a newcomer, there's so much you're already having to assimilate and learn and adapt. And I can only, you know, speak for myself. It's just from either experiencing ourselves in our family or someone we know that we had to help deal with, not necessarily that you have to go through all those to know that, yes, it's horrible driving under the influence. You're not supposed to do this. This is how it works here. And I'm not sure what is the fastest way to pass on that critical information, but maybe, you know, as a church, maybe that is something that we try to do as people start being part of the community. You know, the first step is you need a job, you need to survive, you need to feed the family, you need to find a school for the kids. And so that list of priorities, it's long, and the learning curve can be, you know, overwhelming.
Yeah, I think it's helpful for us to raise this as a even if we don't have the solution, that this is definitely a need, that information isn't getting out there. I've had experiences with different marriage specific ministries and in the church that are for immigrants. They're conducted in Spanish. And one gentleman who I interviewed told me how difficult it was, even though they're there, to get some of the guys in particular to talk about their feelings. And that was just about, I mean, not just that was having to do with their trouble with their marriages that they were having. And this is just a whole another level of difficulty, of obstacle to being able to talk about this. So I think that maybe that could be a recommendation for the church and even the broader community to start to explore different ways to communicate that. Another thing I want to ask about is just when we're looking at, I mean, this last year has been very different in the history and human history in terms of like technology. But I recognize also, like I was mentioning my son earlier, in terms of that generational difference. You know, when I grew up, there was no virtues training, and that wasn't a part of what we did. Have you noticed, Susan, if I can ask you, have you noticed differences in how that's taking root, or differences within that generation that's growing up, like post the abuse crisis, or it continues, I suppose, but yeah.
It's a great question. My own kids are all under the age of 6, so I've been grateful that I don't have to yet navigate the trickiness of the sort of online time too much with them, although my kindergartner is doing kindergarten online. But thinking about this sort of the current younger generation and the Catholic teenagers, especially, who've kind of come up in this post-spotlight church, you know, they've grown up in a very peculiar time in the church. I think, you know, being products of what I guess we could call the abuse crisis era. Of course, public revelations of abuse in the church started coming to light in the 80s, but I think we can all agree that it wasn't until January 2002 when the Boston Globe started publishing its reports that it was another level. And I remember, you know, people were shocked. You know, it was sort of this sense of like, tell me it's not true. I can't believe it. I don't want to believe it. When the Pennsylvania grand jury report came out in 2018, folks weren't like, I can't believe it anymore. It was more like, I believe every single word of this, and I'm mad as hell. You know, so I think there's some people have noted that maybe teenagers don't have that level of kind of undying trust or sort of implicit trust, I guess you could say, in the church, because they've come of age in an era in which the credibility of the church had already been really starkly undercut. On the other hand, it's interesting because those same teenagers have also, if they've been raised sort of in the church or sort of in a parish context, they've come of age in the midst of at least an approach to youth ministry that's very concerned with kind of this traditionalist resurgence, and where youth programming has really been, I guess, reoriented, at least at the parish level, around apologetics and kind of this combative spiritual sensibility. It's like fighting for your faith kind of thing. And so as a result, right, I think you have a lot of teenagers and young adults who really question the integrity of the church. Like they see a church that hasn't really, that's been kind of unwilling to do its own work. And in some way, I think there's a lot of work that the church needs to do to start to win back some of that trust. And honestly, I'm not fully sure that it's possible. I think, you know, teenagers are really looking for honest conversations. I think teens today are very aware of issues of abuse, of trauma. You know, teens today are having, they're ready to have really hard and honest conversations. I mean, look, when I was a teenager, Teen Vogue was publishing like pictures of Jonathan Taylor Thomas. Today, Teen Vogue is publishing like exposés on like political issues. It's like this radical progressive publication that's taken, you know, so it's a different time for teenagers in the US. And I think to see a church that that really has not done its own work and really seems to be unwilling in some ways to have to have those honest conversations. There's always this sense of the church kind of covering its tracks, despite case after case after case that's shown that concealing everything until you get a subpoena is not typically the way to help people to trust you. It still seems like there's so much secrecy, and at least the young people with whom I'm most familiar, it's almost not even a conscious rejection. It's just sort of a sense of I can't in good conscience really associate myself with an institution like that.
Yeah, I'm going to follow up on that, Susan. In terms of how we understand leadership as a society today, obviously we think of the flattening of the hierarchy in our leadership studies. We see things very, very differently today than we did 30 years ago, maybe 10 years ago even. And even a lot of leadership studies are discussing are more sensitive to gender balance within our leaders as well, which is so important. In the church, obviously, because of the all-male priesthood, that looks very different than it does, than it maybe can even look in other places. Are there, in terms of that, do you see where does, I mean, saying that, putting that all out there, I also want to ask about, we transition to ask what the role of the layperson is in this, because there is this, I certainly feel an ongoing frustration with the hierarchy and how it's addressed this. But then as a dad, as a husband, as a brother, etc., I feel like I have a responsibility to act and not continue to expect bishops to act. How do you see that playing out? How do you see lay people now stepping up to address this head on?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I guess I'll start with the limits. I think at the end of the day, lay people lack a structural voice in the institutional church, which really kind of undercuts a lot of these efforts. So, after the Pennsylvania grand jury broke, what we saw was lay people asking, what can we do? What can we do? We want to do something. At my parish, this was a huge conversation. And a lot of folks came to the conclusion after months of listening sessions and meetings and groups and email exchanges that really the only way they could make their voices heard was by withholding parish or diocesan level financial giving, or by withholding themselves, by ceasing to attend Mass. And frankly, neither of those are very good options, and actually fairly depressing ones. So I think the structural voicelessness and placelessness of the laity is a profound hindrance to the kind of agency and reform that's needed. That being said, I think that there are a number of different efforts underway. At my own parish here in Atlanta, there was a year-long effort to try and enact some sort of local reforms, local meaning like parish level reforms, the sense of, we don't have a seat at the table necessarily at the diocesan level, at least not in any sort of binding or meaningful way, or above. So what can we do here in our own backyard? There was a group convened that I was involved in. There were a number of meetings, but after a while, even that broke down. It was an important space, and it was fascinating. I'll just a brief story is that lay people, it's a Jesuit parish, and lay people actually convened a parish-wide examen exercise during the homilies over 2 weeks at every Mass, and invited people actually to reflect on where they sort of see God moving in the church at the moment, where they see where they see needs for reform, what their best hopes and dreams are for the church in light of the Pennsylvania grand jury report. And then they were invited to jot their thoughts down on note cards, and we entered them all into a spreadsheet and sort of looked at the responses and thought about some parish level reforms that could be enacted. And there were a few things in terms of, lay representation on boards and power sharing and lay preaching and things like that. But at the end of the day, the group stopped meeting because there was this sense of, we're honestly not sure where to go from here. And I think that's very, very hard. Maybe, I know Demelis has been very involved at Emory at the Aquinas Center in some of the efforts to kind of convene some conversations among lay leaders and parishes in the area. So maybe she can talk about that.
And so yes, the Catholic lay inter-parish group CLIP in partnership, continues to meet. We have, I think, about over 20 parishes from the archdiocese represented. And in the last couple of years since it started, we had a survey that went out to the archdiocese asking just lay people, things that they thought were important in 3 different areas: in transparency, co-responsibility, and one more that escapes me right now. And so we've started conversations with the Archbishop and with the COO of the Archdiocese, and it's just very baby steps. But like Susan said, there's like this acknowledgement that there's really no pull or power unless they allow us to, so that we're there to suggest or hopefully, collaborate and partner, but it's really, we're not included in the hierarchy. So yes, it's hard to enact and change and implement things at the church-wide level. And I think that the best thing we can do is, what can we do locally? What can we do within those spaces that we do have a voice and that we can make a difference?
Thank you. Just in the interest of time, I think we could get much deeper into all of these topics, but I'm going to transition to we've gotten a number of questions from our audience here. So if we can transition to that. There's a question here about the training of seminarians as pastoral agents, and a shout out to Father Alan Deck, who's a great teacher out there at Legal Marymount in Los Angeles. Great guy. Are you, maybe Susan, you can speak to that as far as that, the training of priests and seminarians and how they're being educated to be more responsive to the Latino community within this?
I think it really varies geographically. And I would say that they're, not to be a pessimist, but I think unfortunately, particularly in areas like Atlanta, where we do have this incredible Latino population, 50%, practically 50% of the Archdiocese of Atlanta, which is basically the northern half of the state, is Latinx. And yet I think it takes a really long time for seminaries to incorporate the sort of formation and education that's culturally responsive, that's needed to sort of serve the populations to whom they are ministering, with whom they are ministering in parishes. I think also, and I'm noting a question here in the Q&A that sort of relates to this as well. Latinos are and other men of color as well are wildly underrepresented in the priesthood. Practically 40% of Catholics in the United States are Latinx or Hispanic, and I'm forgetting the actual percentage, but it's certainly in the single digits of priests nationally are Latinx or Hispanic. So there's a massive underrepresentation there, and so often what you have is, at best, priests who are from Euro-American contexts being sort of given crash courses in intercultural competency. But as folks have noticed, right, ministering with, a community of predominantly Mexican and Mexican American is very different than ministering in a Dominican American community, is very different than ministering in a Venezuelan community, is very different than ministering in a Brazilian community, where obviously there's a vast linguistic difference as well. And so I think with noted exceptions, certainly. And I think that it's a lot different if you're in, say, California than it is in, Montana or Georgia or something. But often that formation becomes inadequate or superficial and in part because it's sort of this act of uh, of not othering, but sort of talking about a population as though they're not also constitutive of the church. So how do we serve our Latino brothers and sisters? How do we serve our African-American brothers and sisters? Which is this implicit, like, well, who are we then? We're obviously white. I think that there's still a profound cultural dissonance and a real lack of representation of voices from these communities. I know, like, the permanent diaconate has been a really important space for Latino men, particularly because of some of those familial and cultural considerations that you mentioned at the beginning. And so in the parish that I was at in Texas, for example, in the Rio Grande Valley, tons and tons and tons of guys going through the diaconate are obviously from Latino families. But I think seminary training is really important, but I think hand in hand with that is just issues of representation as well.
That's interesting. I mean, it seems to speak to a structural problem, because, you know, when we're talking about that overgeneralizing, like I think we so often do about the Latino community, we the one way to address some of that complexity would be to empower lay people more. If lay people had more power, then we're representative of our parishes because we're in our parishes, instead of having to rely on someone that's coming from, oftentimes, from the outside of our communities or our cultures. If there were more empowerment that way, maybe we would be able to address some of those problems more directly. There's a number of questions here to get to. If I can add, this is a follow-up question here that we have about the transitional pattern from about Latinos priests themselves. That, and we have abusive priests that are also immigrants. Is there a pattern that we know about as far as Euro-American priests being sent abroad to the missions when their allegations do come forward?
I think that unfortunately, I think that that's a pattern that's been well documented. I'm more aware of, for example, like the cases among the Jesuits who were sent to remote villages in Alaska. But again, kind of a same thing. Again, that sort of geographic solution. Where can we send this guy? Oh, we'll send him to the missions. Where can we send this guy? Oh, we'll send him to Alaska. Again, sort of trading on this idea. I should say, we often approach clericalism, right, as mainly an issue of ordination status and the sort of power differential that confers. And then sometimes we add like a gender lens to it. But I think taking into account cases like the ones that we've been discussing today helps us to realize that in many ways, clericalism really trades on a lot of structures of domination that are already operative in our societies and in our church. And so when you see these priests who are known abusers to their superiors being intentionally sent away to a community of human beings who are marginalized in some way, whether that's geographically marginalized, whether that's socially or economically marginalized, is sort of a way of getting rid of them. You know, that's a horrifying reality. It's, you know, that what that says about the church is that, you know, is that there are lives that do not matter to people who are in power. I mean, that's sort of, at the end of the day, it's a question of whose life matters, whose financial donations matter. You know, does staying in the good graces of certain communities matter more than protecting the lives of the vulnerable? So yeah, so I think to answer the question, that I think that is unfortunately a broadly documented reality, and I think it's really just a searing conviction, really, of the church and of those in power.
Yeah. Demelis, if I can ask you, there's a number of questions here. I have to confess I'm having a hard time wanting to listen to everything that both of you say, and then trying to read at the same time, and it's not working out. So maybe, Demelis, if I can ask you to answer this question about the question is the person has heard commentators name placing priests on pedestals as a particular vulnerability. In Latinx communities, I've heard others challenge this notion. Do you have a sense of whether or not that's a factor of abuse and cover-up, this idea of like placing priests on pedestals?
Definitely. And I think it goes with what I mentioned before, where you have God's representative on earth. Who am I, a sinner, not just a lay person, but a sinner, to kind of challenge what this person is saying or doing? You know, it's that direct connection of challenging this person's position, opinions, you know, is challenging God himself. And I think that we as a community have a hard time speaking out because of those notions.
Yeah, absolutely. I've heard.
I have
Go ahead, sorry.
and I know we don't have that much time, but I have a pastor who's like just came to this parish and said, "Oh, I'm loving the Latinx community because I say, let's do this," and everybody says, "Sí, padre," and you know, it kind of like the parable, you know, of the sons, the one that says, "Oh yeah, I'm gonna go do that," and you know, doesn't do it, or whether they do it or not, you know, the first response is you don't challenge authority. You don't, especially if it comes from God, you know, if it's the holy man. So whatever padre says is sí, padre.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard and spoken to people who talk about that in terms of the whether or not there's credibility when accusations do come forward, if they're going to believe people who will believe their priest or their deacon or their bishop before they believe their own children. And I think that's sorry, yeah, Demelis?
Yes, so I was going to say also it's in, you know, as a general rule, I know there's places that do it better than others, but you do also have within a parish, you have the split of the English speaking parish and the Spanish speaking parish. And sometimes one doesn't communicate with the other. And I think that also perpetuates those patterns of abuse within a community that is not going to complain, that is, you know, afraid of speaking up just to begin with, and where all this other, you know, immigration status and, you know, all those other barriers kind of come to collide with all of that.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's very important insights, and as far as also as we attempt to work toward to a solution to eradicating this problem altogether, I think those are important factors to consider. There's another question here, Susan, if I can ask you about this. Do you think that there's too much of an emphasis on monetizing the accountability, and or should we be talking about establishing mandates of conduct and distribution of punishment?
It's a good question, and I think it speaks directly to some of what we were discussing earlier about how that sort of accountability that takes place through the work of lawyers and courts, et cetera, is not a form of justice that's available to everyone. And that's also not a form of justice that has cultural currency universally. So I think this is not to go too far afield, but I think there was a lot of talk a couple of years ago, 2 Februaries ago, when Pope Francis convened that global gathering on the sexual abuse crisis. And a lot of people, particularly here in the United States, wanted, I mean, which sounds unrealistic in some way. If anybody's ever been in like a 2 or 3 day long meeting, you don't come out of it with like a 100-page document of, you know, decided things. But there were a lot of people who were really disappointed that meeting didn't conclude with like, here's what we decided, and here's how we're going to punish abusers, and here are the procedures universally. Now, of course, the following May, Pope Francis did follow up with some global norms, which was really important because it was a recognition that this actually isn't like a Western problem. This is a global problem. But it was a complication in that February gathering. And part of what was at stake was that you had representatives from all over the world. And in a lot of parts of the world, justice isn't the same as getting a monetary settlement. Justice isn't the same as getting a court decision. Justice doesn't primarily come through the penal system or the court system. That's not to say that that's not important. I think it's vital. I mean, I think part of the problem in the church here in the United States is that for too long, sexual abuse by priests has been treated as a sin, but not a crime. And so these are, I think my friends who are not Catholic, their first question is like, what, like, these aren't some different class of human. Like these are criminals, reported to the police. But that being said, I think that the question, to get back to that, I think the question is a good one, because I think what it raises is that looking at the abuse crisis through a culturally sensitive lens, we see that monetary settlements can't be the be all to end all of accountability, particularly because if we're talking about victims from undocumented communities, right, there's not going to be a willingness to go through the court system. That could pose actually real existential risks to folks. As far as kind of approaching accountability with a disposition of sort of a broader need for culpability and sort of reconciliation and forgiveness, I'm of two minds. I think after, again, it gets back to the question about what can lay people do too. I think in some sense it spoke to the powerlessness of lay people, that after the grand jury report came out, you had a lot of Catholics on social media, for example, sort of saying, oh, well, we should all as lay people, kind of don like a sackcloth and ashes type of thing. And we should, fast for, in recompense for the sins of our priests, et cetera. Which is, there's a beauty to that sentiment. And I appreciate both this sense of solidarity, although it was interesting that it was solidarity with priests and not with victims, at least how it was kind of stated. And also a recognition that sort of is a social or structural issue. This isn't just about the actions of isolated bad apples. This is a systemic thing. On the other hand, I'm wary of efforts to sort of democratize the responsibility too broadly, because in some sense I think that that's allowed it to perpetuate the sense of like, well, this was the chain of command, and whose fault really? It was obviously the perpetrator, but then their superior didn't report, and their superior, and actually there were no procedures in place, and they tried to report but they weren't listened to. There's already this real diffusion of responsibility, which I think is also can also be complicated. But I'm just looking at the question here, but really recognizing that the trauma and violation of trust, I think, is something that's really important. This is a wound that has hurt the entire church, even if you are not a victim of abuse yourself or a victim of abuse by a priest. This is a wound in which we all share, and I think which we all need to learn how to confront together.
Thank you. This is obviously just the beginning of the conversation that the church needs to have, and a continuation of the conversation that we've been having as a church. So just want to thank both of you, and all the questions. I'm sorry that we weren't able to get to all of them. We're just out of time here. But if I can hand this off to Catherine Osborne for some concluding thoughts.
Not much of a concluding thought. I just want to thank all of you so much for being here, for sharing your experience and your voices, and yeah, to affirm that we're really at the beginning of dealing with this issue in a way that kind of understands the racial, cultural, immigration status differences that make up people's experience of this. So thank you all so much for being here. Thank you also again to those of you who have joined us for this conversation. Just want to one last time encourage you to seek out support if you need it. Either if you need to get in touch with us to put you in touch with support, we are happy to do that, or of course to talk to a support system that you already have and trust. So thank you again so much for joining us, and we will thank our panel with some sort of virtual applause. And we encourage you to join us for future events in this series. All
Thank you.
right. Thanks, everybody.